Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 292, Bloody Mary. On November 20th, 1554, Reginald Pole, the official papal legate, came ashore at Dover. It had been 23 years since he fled England. Parliament, just 2 days later, on November 22nd, officially reversed the Bill of Attainder that was still, technically, hanging over his head. In October, the Papacy and Queen Mary had resolved the final issue holding back his return: ecclesiastical property. Everyone agreed that Pole would have the authority to grant dispensation to those who had purchased former monastic lands, while Mary, for her part, promised to see as much of it returned as possible. 6 days later, orders went out for hymns of praise to be sung in every parish in England. The Queen was pregnant. Not really, but they thought so at the time. Shortly thereafter, Pole addressed Parliament. His speech was filled with high-flying rhetoric. England was a chosen nation, the first kingdom freely to accept the faith of Christ as a gift from the papacy. Pole's emphasis on the, quote, manifold benefits that this realm hath received from the Apostolic See, end quote, was the antithesis to the antagonistic Anglo-Papal history devised by William Tyndale and others, and funneled into the ear of Henry VIII. Pole rehearsed the disasters, quote, the tumults, the effusion and blood, end quote, afflicting Germany since its departure from Roman obedience, as well as violence against the conscience raging in England since all good laws gave way to, quote, the lust and carnal affection of one man, end quote. And of course, we're talking about Henry VIII. So now, everything's getting pinned on Henry VIII. That's sort of the plan. He's going to be the scapegoat. Still, when all seemed lost and hopeless, the light of true religion burned in a few hearts. At least so thundered Pole. Mary, quote, a virgin helpless, naked, and unarmed, end quote, secured victory over tyrants, and now happily joined to a prince of like religion. Pole had high hopes for Philip. Charles V was like David, he said, who began work on the temple, appeasing controversies in religion. His son, therefore, was the Solomon who would bring it to completion. It was precisely, for those keeping track of score at home, what evangelicals said about Henry and Edward. Catholics and Protestants, I guess, habituated and lived within the same world of biblical metaphor. At the close of his speech, Pole called on Parliament to remove any remaining impediments standing in the way of reunion with Rome. He finished his speech with a flourish. Quote, I come not to destroy, but to build. I come to reconcile, not to condemn. I come not to compel, but to call again, end quote. On November the 29th, representatives of the Lords and Commons jointly prepared a petition to the Crown, asking that, quote, this realm and dominions might be again reunited with the Church of Rome by the means of Lord Cardinal Pole, end quote. The following day, in a moving ceremony, Pole absolved the realm from the sin of schism and reconciled England with Rome. It was November 30th, the feast of St. Andrew. In a world of perfect symbolism, the event might have fallen elsewhere. St. Andrew was, of course, Scotland, not England's patron. But in Scotland, too, Protestantism was on the defensive in 1554. Its English support withered since the death of Edward VI. A few months later, the Earl of Arran was replaced as regent by the Catholic Mary of Guise, French-born widow of James V, and mother to the young Mary, Queen of Scots, as we know, now safely in France, and betrothed to the Dauphin. There was cause for Catholic rejoicing across Britain, yet Valois France, the dominant power in Scotland, was the sworn enemy to Habsburg Spain, now the dynastic partner to England. A bill repealing no fewer than 19 acts of Henry VIII and nullifying royal supremacy was introduced into Parliament in late December and passed on the 3rd of January. Unusually, it contained the text of a parliamentary supplication requesting that all monastic lands might remain in lay hands, quote, clear from all dangers and censures of the Church, end quote, as well as Pole's consequent dispensation, which thereby gave the status of the statute law. This was a clear indication that there was ongoing nervousness throughout England around the church land question, and it was a concession that Pole very grudgingly accepted. But with this question settled, the lords who blocked the revival of medieval heresy legislation earlier in the year now cheerfully voted it through. They got to keep their lands. That's what they cared about. Reconciliation with Rome was a return, but also a departure. As it transpired, the first major saint's day following the passage of the legislation was the 25th of January, the feast of the conversion of St. Paul. It was a fitting focus for public thanksgiving, with processions and bonfires. No one could miss the symbolic point of the celebrations. Wriothesley put it, quote, to give God laud and praise for the conversion of the realm to the Catholic faith, the conversion of St. Paul being simply perfect for the occasion. The Grey Friars would observe similarly, quote, the joy of the people that were converted likewise as St. Paul was converted, end quote. There was a real, almost evangelical fervor to the re-Romanizing of English Catholicism in every way that's ironic. Conversion applied, though, conscious, individual commitment rather than just going with the flow. This was the ideal of the bishops. Bonner, back in London, now in the lead again, was eager to convert this into reality. So on February 19, 1555, he ordered all parishioners in the forthcoming Lent to be individually absolved in confession of the sins of schism and heresy. He empowered the parochial clergy, once they themselves were reconciled, to act as his deputies for this. It was more than merely formal exercise. Bonner anticipated that ordinary curates might not be able to, quote, satisfy the minds and to appease the consciousness of some of the parishioners, end quote. And so he instructed his archdeacons to produce lists of the best learned priests in each area. Those with troubled consciences could choose an expert spiritual guide to have their doubts forever resolved. Instructions printed that Lent for the use of confessors in the Diocese of York directed that before reconciling penitents, they needed to be examined on their faith in the real presence of Christ and on whether or not they believed that the Holy Father, the Pope, was the real head of a universal and Catholic Church. And so, across England in 55, ordinary men and women were required to identify, and for many of them actually, to become something they'd never been before, true Roman Catholics. To affirm spiritual supremacy of the Pope in 1555 was a different matter from doing so in 1515. It was another of the regular conjunctions in the English Reformation. Now, policy swerves and served, not so much to confuse people, but to educate them, and within limits, at least in theory, to empower them. As with Henry VIII's mass oath-swearing 20 years before, the effects were equivocal. Many people were confirmed in their acknowledged allegiance to the religious and political objectives of the authorities. Others just simply internalized their doubts and said and did outwardly as they were told. A smaller group was encouraged and energized in conscientious opposition. A little later, Bonner would be told by Ralph Allerton, a landed magnate, and a suspect he was interrogating, that, quote, this is, I think, very accurate, there are in England 3 religions. The first was that which you hold, Roman Catholicism. The second is clean contrary to the same. That is, of course, the evangelical faith. And the third is neuter, being indifferent, that is to say, observing all things that are commanded outwardly as though they were your part, his heart being set wholly against the same, end quote. My guess is most people in England fell into that third category. Now, the first burn under Bloody Mary, yes, I suppose it's a bit of a misnomer, was that of John Rogers on February the 4th, 1555. Rogers was Tyndale's one-time collaborator on the English Bible. He was also a well-known London preacher. Gardner hoped that Rogers would recant, and to be fair to Rogers, he actually was a Catholic in a way, but Rogers asserted that while he was Catholic, he rejected the authority of the Pope. He would never accept reunion with Rome. Gardner believed that Rogers wouldn't burn because he would ultimately recant at the last moment. He was wrong. Rogers went to the stake courageously amid shows of support from the crowd. Allegedly, several members of said crowd gathers his ashes afterwards as a memento. He was the first martyr under Bloody Mary. Advisors immediately told both Mary and Philip that they needed to refrain from further public executions. It was bad for morale, and all it was doing was encouraging further resistance. They didn't listen. Another 3 public executions followed within a week. A London rector was burned at Coventry on the 8th of February. Another died at Suffolk. A third, John Hooper, burned at Gloucester. His death was particularly gruesome. The wood was still green and took an eternity to catch. All 4 men had been prominent members of Edward's court. The hope in Mary's court had been that recantation would follow recantation. Parliament had, after all, appeared perfectly willing to accept reunion with the papacy. Why shouldn't everyone just follow the law? Well, they didn't. In fact, what happened was the exact opposite of what Mary and her supporters had hoped. Burning after burning only fueled the fires, pun intended, of resistance. There was a domino effect, sure, but the dominoes were falling the wrong way. The 18 months at Edward's death had given everyone time to think. The late 16th century was a period of absolutes, and in that context, martyrdom looked downright beneficial. John Hooper wrote in one of his last letters from prison, quote, "Now is the time of trial to see whether we fear more God or man," end quote. In the weeks preceding his execution, another man, Lawrence Saunders, was imprisoned alongside the leading preacher, and St. Paul's lecturer John Cardmaker was arrested in November 1554 while attempting to flee. Cardmaker discovered he feared man more than God and was waiting to subscribe articles of recantation when Saunders managed to pull him back. Martyrdom was a solitary vocation, but it was usually anticipated and embraced with the advice and example of others. It was also a spectacle of performance. The symbolism of judicial burning was of a terrible yet just punishment for the worst imaginable crimes. The flames consumed a body that had no claim to rise in glory on the last day, mimicked the hellfire that was an inexorable fate for the unrepentant heretic's soul. But the authorities could never control entirely how the meaning of the event would be perceived and understood, and the condemned thought hard about ways to make the show their own. At his burning outside Coventry, Saunders appeared, quote, in an old gown and a shirt barefooted, end quote. And as he was led to the stake, he fell to the ground multiple times, flat, prostrate, and prayed. All Christians were called to the imitation of Christ, but execution was an opportunity to invoke comparisons with the Passion in particularly intense and memorable ways. When he reached the stake, Saunders took it in his arms, kissed it, and said, quote, "Welcome the cross of Christ," end quote. Soon, lay victims started going to the pyre for their convictions as well. The very first might have been Thomas Tomkins, a weaver. According to legend, as he was trying to elicit a confession, Bishop Bonner held Tomkins' hand over an open flame, as if to ram home the implications of continuing down this path. It didn't matter. Tomkins wouldn't confess. Now, interestingly, what side you were on was now also quickly becoming a matter of personal grooming. To distance themselves from the clean-shaven papists, evangelicals grew long beards. According to some, this was also a show of masculinity to differentiate evangelical preachers who could have wives from the Catholic priests who could not. Around the same time as Tomkins, another bearded layman went to the stake at Cardiff. Rollins White was an illiterate fisherman, about 60 years old. He had memorized scripture from the readings of his son, and who, on Mary's ascension, placed himself at the head of an evangelicalized conventicle. The background was unusual, but his case exhibited several features that characterized the executions throughout that first spring of Mary's reign and beyond. There was a vigorous and prolonged effort to induce him to recant. The local bishop employed threatening words and promises during a year of imprisonment, which is a long time for the early modern period. First in Cardiff Castle, and then later at the bishop's house. White's commitment to a cause he first espoused in late middle age was fervent and uncompromising. When the bishop caused a mass to be said for his conversion, White appeared at the moment of the elevation to announce, quote, "I bow not to this idol," end quote. The burning was a contested event. A priest preached in favor of the real present and the Pope, while White shouted for the crowd to give no credence to this quote-unquote false prophet. The crowd itself was divided. White's friends grasped his hand at the stake for comfort, but others called out, "Set him to fire." 14 heretics died at the stake, half of them in Essex, before Easter of 1555. They included another bishop burned in the 30th of March. On Easter Sunday itself, the 14th of April, a scandalous event took place at a church nearby Westminster Abbey. During the distribution of communion, a man came into church and repeatedly stabbed the priest, whose name was John Cheetham, with a wood knife. Cheetham was badly injured, and blood was splashed onto the consecrated hosts. The assailant, a man by the name of William Flower, was a former monk of Ely, who later admitted his actions had been wrong, and, as he claimed, unpremeditated. Yet, coming into church and, quote, "there seeing the people falling before a most shameful and detestable idol," and, quote, zeal for God's honor simply overcame him. It was a somewhat uniquely shocking case, but the behavior wasn't unique at all. Mary's officers, contrary to public belief, weren't rushing around to arrest anyone for evangelical beliefs. Those who arrested were people who were publicly flaunting the laws. Many were arrested for public demonstrations during the Mass itself. Heretics were punished for their belief, that much is true, but rarely were those punished minding their own business. Some of those punished for heresy weren't heretics at all. They were made so after the fact. John Tooley, a properly convicted felon, was hanged on April the 26th. His crime had nothing to do with religion, it was robbing a Spaniard. But at his execution, his death was choreographed as a religious martyrdom. Tooley, before his execution, read prepared prayers from the Edwardian prayer book. 300 in the crowd responded in unison, quote, "Amen, amen, amen," end quote. Linking the patriotic anti-Spanish clause with the godly anti-popish one was a conscious and very effective strategy for the evangelicals. Published in 1555, A Warning for England reported in very graphic terms alleged Spanish atrocities in the Kingdom of Naples. These, according to that tract, would soon be visited on England. And what was almost worse, extortionate levels of taxation. It pressed hard on a raw nerve, quote, "No man is so ignorant, but he knoweth right well the desire of the bishops is to have the abbey lands restored," end quote. And that, now that was the sore spot for England. It's all well and good to swear allegiance to the Pope, but any mention of having to give back the monastic lands, that would turn the lords against you pretty quickly. On the 13th of May, about 2 weeks after false rumors of a birth of a royal son prompted premature celebrations, the Venetian ambassador reported the confiscation in London of 1,000 copies of a dialogue, quote, "full of seditious and scandalous things against their majesties' persons," end quote. Later that month, there was a serious outbreak of violence near the court. A crowd of 500 armed Englishmen confronting Spaniards with 5 or 6 killed. Another incident took place on Corpus Christi Day, the 13th of June, with a mob assembling outside the church where the Spanish, quote, "including the most noble and illustrious of that nation," end quote, were attending Mass and preparing to go on procession. Only with difficulty were these men persuaded to disperse. Now, most likely, this refers to the Corpus Christi procession, which Philip's Spanish Dominican chaplain organized that year in an attempt to restart the ancient custom across the nation. As you can tell, it didn't work. In the meantime, the anti-Spanish cause had gained a surprising new recruit. The The death of Julius III, the Pope, on the 23rd of March, was followed by the brief pontificate of Marcellus II, who then followed him to the grave pretty quickly thereafter on the 1st of May. His successor, elected on the 23rd of that same month, was the zealous inquisitor Cardinal Giampietro Carafa. It was a huge blow for Reginald Pole, whose orthodoxy Carafa was known to mistrust. Also for Philip and Mary, Carafa was a patriotic Neapolitan who might well have shared some of the perspectives from that very same tract, The Warning for England, about the hatred they should feel towards the Spanish rule over Naples, his very homeland. Nonetheless, the new pope wrote swiftly to assure Philip and Mary of paternal goodwill, and Pole's letter of congratulation hailed their shared interest in the reform of the church. But as we're going to see in this episode, and especially in the next episode, this new pope is going to be anything but a friend to Philip and Mary. Reform and repression tended to go in tandem during the late 16th century. The same day as the revived Corpus Christi procession, the government published a new list of banned books for the first time, including many authors outside England, specifically one John Knox of Scotland. Things took a dark turn in the late summer 1555. The Queen had come to terms with the reality that she was not pregnant. At the same time, her husband, Philip II, departed for the Netherlands. More on that front very soon. Evidently, Queen Mary decided to drown her sorrows with fire. Between the 30th of May and the end of September that year, 51 English people died at the stake. That is more, by the way, than were burned for heresy between Henry VIII's break with Rome in 1535 and the present year. So Mary burned more people in 3 months than Henry or Edward had in 20 years. What can I say? Sometimes nicknames are deserved. The drive against heresy was a real team effort. Some convictions were the direct product of actions by the Privy Council, others from bishops, and still others from aggressive lay magistrates. Some of the latter were ardent Catholics, but others were political opportunists. These were men with scores to settle, who saw opportunities and then they took them. Few of these victims went to their deaths quietly. Many started wearing long white robes. True, these did catch fire more quickly, but they also brought to the mind innocence and martyrdom. The burnings were the final stage of a legal proceeding, that's true, but they were also brutal and somewhat unruly affairs, with the mob often jeering and or shouting encouragement toward the victim in equal measure. The most important burning of 1555 took place on the 16th of October, when 2 former bishops, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, went together to the stake. They were finally put on trial at the end of September, before a trio of Catholic bishops. The accused maintained a defiant stand, though not without moments of unintentional comedy. Ridley, who removed his hat upon entering the court, insisted on replacing it when the Pope's name was mentioned, so literally whenever he would put his hat back on. When the commissioners demanded respectful treatment as representatives of the cardinal legate, Ridley knelt to show his reverence for Pole for his royal blood, but then sprang up again to demonstrate his lack of esteem for Pole as the agent of usurping power. I don't know whether or not he was putting on his hat over and over again as he did that. Latimer went on to interrupt the opening oration to challenge the definition of the Catholic Church, saying, quote, "Christ gave knowledge that the disciples should have persecution and trouble. How think you then, my lords, it is most like that the see of Rome, which hath been a continual persecutor, is rather the church or a small flock, which hath been continually persecuted of it, even unto death." End quote. Once more, it's easy to see the evangelical sense of rediscovered purpose, almost perhaps a sense of relief at knowing that they were again going through the validation process supplied by suffering and oppression. Later on, Latimer would say, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out." He said that, accordingly, as the pyre was lit beneath the two of them. These words have come to us down the centuries. The question is, of course, did he actually say them? They're an echo of a heavenly voice heard in the Roman arena by 2nd century martyr Saint Polycarp, as recorded by the early church historian Eusebius. The words appear in the 2nd edition of Fox's Acts and Monuments, but not in the first, which came out 7 years earlier, and without any evidence of new eyewitnesses being consulted. Whether he said them or not, of course, Latimer undoubtedly saw himself and Ridley as links in a chain of true disciples of Christ, persecuted by the ungodly down the ages. From his prison window, Thomas Cranmer watched his friends go to their fate, a poignant echo of Thomas More's witnessing the last journey of his friends just 20 years before. Cranmer's own trial opened on the 12th of September, and because, unlike Ridley and Latimer, he was a bishop and properly consecrated and installed into Roman rites, it was a much more elaborate and formal affair. Earlier disputations covered Cranmer's favorite ground of Eucharistic doctrine, but now the questioning, which was relentlessly pursued by the Catholic bishops, focused on the actions of Cranmer's own career, and of course, on the concept of royal supremacy, to which he had faithfully hitched his wagon. At one point, Cranmer just walked straight into a trap. Quote, "Was it ever so in Christ's church?" one of the Catholic bishops demanded, in response to Cranmer's own assertion that every king was rightfully supreme head in his own domains. "It was so," Cranmer responded. But then what pressed the Catholic bishop of wicked kings? What about Nero, the Roman emperor? He was assuredly the world's mightiest ruler in the years following Christ's resurrection. It was also a byword for tyranny and persecution. Reluctantly, Cranmer had to concede the point that he had walked into, that Nero, no less than Henry VIII, had been the supreme head of Christ's church on earth, which is ridiculous. Conviction, though, it didn't matter. That was a foregone conclusion. A succession of enemies from Cranmer's past, like the ghost of Christmas past, just popped up and came in to give evidence that the archbishop was a promoter of heretics and an author of heretical works. Cranmer himself insisted that he only acted, quote, "to improve the corrupt ways of the church," end quote, perhaps an echo of his 1533 consecration oath to bring about changes for the church and to reform it. It didn't really matter, because Pope Paul IV had a mandate for Cranmer's trial, including a formal and impractical require for him to appear personally in Rome within 80 days to answer charges against him. At the moment, all this ridiculous order did was serve as a stay of execution. For now, Cranmer was returned, a condemned man, to his cell. Now, while all this was going on, Bishop Bonner formalized the treatment that he thought would cure England of his heresy. Like a teacher assigning reading to reluctant students, he forced all London clergy to read a new book he had written on the subject of doctrine and preached chapter 1 of the same to their parishioners each and every Sunday. It was to be religion, MacDonald's style. The book was issued along with 13 homilies, compiled by Bonner's chaplains and first published in July. The idea of an officially approved set of sermons for ordinary clergy to work systematically through was a blatant stealing of the evangelicals' M.O., and indeed, actually, 2 of the homilies, one on charity and one on the misery of all mankind, were actually just recycled with very light revisions from Cranmer's own 1547 collection. The main text had also a familiar feel. It was modeled closely on an earlier necessary doctrine, the King's Book of 1543. In both title and contents, the book was a marker of stability and continuity, a nod of acknowledgement to conservatives who, like Bonner himself, had rode out Edwardian years in loyalty to the religious settlement of Henry VIII. Once more, it seemed like people were willing to turn back the clock, but just to 1547. Even Bonner acknowledged how hard doing this was going to be. He wrote how the Catholic religion had been, quote, accounted and taken for superstition, end quote. So for the moment, he was really focusing on the key role of the church in helping people achieve salvation. He focused on a couple of key points. the Nicene Creed, the Ten Commandments, 7 deadly sins, sacraments, Lord's Prayer, and the Hail Mary. These, he believed, were the hallmarks of a proper Catholic faith. He tried to shy away from words he felt might provoke disquiet. Words like purgatory and certainly the word pope were decidedly absent from this book. He knew both were non-starters, at least at the moment. When he talked about authority, Bonner was always careful to use the term church, not pope. How he was going to get around the idea that the pope, of course, was the undisputed head of the Roman Catholic Church in the long run, I have no idea, because he's never going to get there. Now, Pole, for his part, he wanted to be more aggressive. He called a clerical assembly at Westminster in November 1555. His notion was for a centralized, top-down approach to church reformation. The first hurdle was clerical income. There wasn't any. Mary declared that the traditional tithe, the 10th, would be returned to the church. Pole argued that this money would come essentially from the church taxing itself, but Parliament was less convinced. Many in the body balked at the notion of reinstating secular payments to the church. In the end, when a bill was presented, it passed, but not without some obvious discomfort. Not every bill in Parliament went Mary's way either. In December, a bill to confiscate the property of exiles who refused to turn to England was beaten back. Some who voted it down definitely sympathized with the exiles, but most were simply just nervous about the precedent it would set in terms of private property rights. On November the 12th, 1555, Stephen Gardiner passed away at his home. More than anything, he had been a symbol of the early English Reformation and would be tied to Henry VIII until his end and beyond. Many rejoiced at his passing, seeing it as a divine sign that the conservative cause, of which he was a part, was doomed. In reality, of course, he was just an old man who had died of natural causes. By the 10th of February 1556, the synod, which had been called for the reformation of the church, had completed its business and produced a set of decrees for the reformation of England. A reminder that in the 16th century, of course, the word was not the exclusive property of Rome's enemies. The tone was set by its first decree. Henceforth, throughout the realm, the feast of St. Andrew was to be kept as a day of solemn commemoration, with a procession and a sermon to give thanks for, quote, the return of this kingdom and the unity of the church, end quote. The relationship with Rome was now a thread that needed to be interwoven into the fabric of English parish life. We're going to just literally put it into the calendar. Other decrees held up a mirror to the leaders of the church. Prelates were to live soberly, chastely, and piously. They weren't to go for pomp or pride. They were to dress simply. They were to keep no retinue. Their diet was to be basic. The great abuse of bishops and head of colleges failing to reside in their places of duty, that was over. Absenteeism among lower clergy, too, was condemned, along with the pluralism that gave rise to it. By pluralism, what I mean is a priest owning more than one benefice that he never visits just to draw the income from it. That, as you may recall, was one of the major criticisms of the Roman Catholic Church throughout the early Reformation. And now the Roman Catholic Church, only about 50 years later, was going to do something about it. All clergy with cure of souls, including bishops, were required to provide sermons to the people. Pastoral office, it was noted, quote, chiefly consists in preaching of the divine word, end quote. This is an assessment of which evangelicals could scarcely have disputed. The reform of the clergy was crucial to the reconciliation plan. Everyone knew what a mess the clergy had been in before the Reformation. Better clergy had been one of the key benefits, actually, with the schism from Rome. Pole wanted to be sure it didn't become an excuse for it to happen again. From now on, all bishops were required to vet their clergy, who had to swear an oath that they did not acquire their benefices via simony. Most significantly, for the first time, the church would establish a seminary to educate the sons of poor families and train future priests. It was the beginning of a solution to a centuries-old problem. Later on, the Council of Trent would likewise follow in England's footsteps. There were other forms that were discussed, but were never completed. One was the topic of a vernacular Bible. That issue was simply too divisive. This was all a serious effort at reform, not merely a reaction to Protestant complaints. One of the critiques of Pole throughout the centuries has been his rejection of an offer by Ignatius Loyola to send some newly trained Jesuits to help with the reform process. But Pole had plans for his own seminary, and so he rejected the offer. Pole, a leading light of early sessions of the Council of Trent, was scarcely insulated from the current of trends of reform, which were wafting through the wider Catholic Church in the 1550s. He was, actually unlike numerous other Catholics, in no way an opponent of the Jesuits. In fact, he wrote a supportive letter of condolence on Ignatius's death in July of 1556. And he was, in fact, an active supporter of other Reformed religious movements. By the summer of 1555, the Dominican order was back in England, established at Smithfield. There were a few English brothers, but most of these Dominicans were, for the moment, Spanish. The appearance of monks and friars, clad once more in their distinctive habits, was one of the most dramatic symbols of the repudiation of Henry's, as well as, of course, Edward's, works of Reformation. It was one of the most visible pointers to the limit of restoration. There was little to no prospect of hundreds of dissolved religious houses simply springing back to life, and a line under the past was drawn by Rome itself. In Rome, in the June of 1555, Pope Paul IV formally dissolved all the houses suppressed by Henry VIII. Any restorations going forward would technically be new foundations. There was some further reassurance to anxious lay owners of ex-monastic estates, but it didn't inspire in them any impulse to just simply give back the land. Some lay people gave piously in their wills to refounded monasteries, but endowments for refoundation, in the end, came almost exclusively from the crown. Only 7 religious houses were reestablished nationwide between 1555 and 1558, with plans in the works for half a dozen or so more. The most significant refoundation was that of a monastery which was never really dissolved, the Royal Showcase Church of Westminster Abbey. Only around 100 of perhaps 1,500 surviving former monks again took up the habit, though what monastic life lacked in quantity, it made up for in quality. Prestigious refoundations, including the return of the resilient corps of the Carthusians, returned to Sheen in November 1555, and the Brigittine nuns returned in August of 1557. Others might have returned if given the chance. In Yorkshire, former Cistercians were in apparent expectation of restoration, but by 1558, things would be just about over. In Mary's reign, many of these monastic orders set about reassembling their monastic libraries, buying back hundreds of volumes in what was to be ultimately a vain hope of return to full communal life. Ultimately, the non-return of major monastic life in England was a major indication of the triumph of the reform, started under Henry and finished under Edward. But it was also a sign of changing ecclesiastical priorities. Rather than monasteries, the church sought to build new hospitals and seminaries. The church needed to be more responsive to the changing times. It seems that was really one lesson the Catholic movement had learned throughout the turbulent early 16th century. The question, as we will see next time, is, would it be enough? Now, as always, if you've enjoyed the episode, you can check out the links in the show notes. Got a link to the website there, and also have a link to the free trial of the Patreon feed. It's the best way to support the show. It's as little as $1 a month, $12 a year, and you can help this thing go all the way up to the present day of Western history.